Directora General, COMEXI.
Gracias. Hola, buenos días a todos y muchísimas gracias por estar aquí. Voy a cambiar a inglés por cortesía con nuestros invitados. My name is Mariana Campero, and I am the Executive Director of the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations, COMEXI. It is a great privilege to welcome two distinguished guests from Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London, who will discuss today the many issues raised by the 2016 Brexit referendum. Of course, its impact within the United Kingdom, such as the implications of a deal or no deal or a sensible deal, the likelihood of calling for a general election, its impact on Europe and the upcoming European elections, the cost that the economic uncertainty has had on GDP growth in the United Kingdom, in addition to the risks of losing access to the 500 million customers of the European market. And now this morning there was an article in the FT that said that the likelihood of a Scottish referendum has also gone up. But also, and maybe more importantly, how this historic event was also a reflection of the bigger trends that we are seeing around the world, such as the rise of populism, a backlash to globalization, the rising inequality, and a growing divide between cities and rural. All of these are just examples of the threats on the current international order. And for this, please join me in welcoming Dr. Leslie Vinjamuri and Dr. Robin Niblett. Robin is the director of Chatham House and an expert on the UK foreign policy and European political and economic security. Dr. Vinjamuri is the head of the US of the Americas program, Dean of the Academy for Leadership in International Affairs at Chatham House. Welcome to Mexico. The conversation today will be moderated by Ambassador Andrés Rozental, the founding president of COMEXI, a senior advisor at Chatham House, and a former ambassador to the United Kingdom. Ambassador, thank you so much for making this possible. And finally, I want to thank Ricardo González Horta, partner of Deloitte, National Director of Taxes and the Legal Services at Deloitte, and Carlos Moya, who's not yet with us, also partner of COMEXI and corporate members of COMEXI. They have been an incredible support, and thank you for their generosity and allowing us to have this event in this amazing space. Today's agenda will consist of a presentation by our panelists, followed by a conversation with Ambassador Rozental. After that, if we have enough time, there will be a Q&A session with the audience. And finally, Ricardo González Horta will provide the closing remarks and a comment on the economic consequences of uncertainty. I am sure this will be a very interesting conversation, and maybe we will leave this room understanding what the backstop really means. Thank you so much, and Ambassador, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank you, Mariana, and a special thanks to our friends at Deloitte for hosting us today. For me, it's a very special occasion because I've been involved with Chatham House now for, I'd say, about 25 or 30 years, from when I was first posted to the UK back in the 1970s, late 70s, all the way through now, when I, thanks to Robin's invitation, form a part of a group of senior policy advisors at Chatham House. So to have the director of Chatham House and the director of the US and Americas program in Mexico for the first time is a privilege and an honor. So welcome to both of you. We're very happy to have you. Before I ask Robin to lead off with a brief presentation, I wanted to mention one thing that I think is very important. Over the years, I've tried to push Chatham House to have a Latin American focus, in addition to all the other focuses, foci, or whatever you say them in plural, that it has. And I'm pleased to say that with the generous support of corporate sponsors and others, we finally now are about to have, already launched and about to continue to have a Latin American program at Chatham House, which Leslie is going to head. And we're very pleased that that's now going to be part of the London scene as we go forward. Latin America is a very important region. With the UK either in or out of the EU, we don't know yet, but whether it's in or whether it's out, it's in a very important region for the UK and for international affairs, for Europe, and therefore for Chatham House. So we're very proud to be able to do that. So Robin, start us off. You have been following Brexit, obviously, because you sit in London most of the time. You understand the dynamics between what's going on in the domestic political scene, what's going on in the negotiations between the Europeans and the UK, and probably have a good insight as to, first of all, why has it taken so long since the referendum for things to finalize? They're still not finalized. The new deadline, I think, is in October, but there are European parliamentary elections coming up now at the end of this month, and apparently Prime Minister May would prefer not to have to participate in those elections because she fears perhaps a conservative defeat to a great extent. So lead us off on that. I'd also like to ask you about populism, because I've heard you talk about it. Populism is a funny thing, because some people define it one way, others define it a totally different way, opposite way. So I think we'd be very interested to hear you speak on that. And after your presentation, I'll ask Leslie to talk to us a little bit about transatlantic relations. How Leslie is an American, so she has insight on Mr. Trump, which of course here in Mexico is very important. We need to have insight on Mr. Trump. Transatlantic relations, what's going on with the US in its foreign policy towards us here in Mexico, Latin America. And if we have time at the end, I'll bring up some of the subjects which are in the headlines today: Venezuela, Cuba, because we also think that those are important. And both of these wonderful people have been following and know a lot about it. So, Robin, lead us off.
Well, Andrés, first of all, many thanks to you and to Mariana for welcoming us here, for all of COMEXI for being our hosts. Great to be able to dip into the think tank scene here in Mexico City, and also for being such a great champion and supporter of Chatham House for so long, and long may it continue, let me add as well. And I think it's almost impossible for us to come here without having had our Latin America initiative launched. I think that's why it's taken me so long to. I was too embarrassed to sit up on the stage here with you and for us not to have this new initiative underway, even though we've been able to involve many people from Latin America in our work, really including this as part of our purview, even from London, which tends, as you know, not to look to this part of the world quite as frequently as it does to others. The timing for this visit is great. Timing is interesting, I suppose, as well, because of what you've asked us to talk about, this title. As I was thinking about it on the flight over here, actually I came from San Francisco, which was interesting because it's so nice to escape from Brexit mania on the west coast of America. But you know, one would want to start almost with international order, populism, and then and end up with Brexit. But let's start at the other end. But I will take advantage of your follow-up question and put it right at the beginning, which is, what does populism mean to me? I think populism is a platform. It's a political platform of the populists. And populists are not the people. Populists are politicians, in my opinion. Populists are politicians who work off public anger and frustration. And often that anger and frustration is justified. It may have been long growing. It may be driven by deep structural reasons. It may have been driven by bad decisions taken at a particular point in previous years. But the people, or a large majority of them in a populist environment, are angry. And populist politicians, to my mind, take advantage of the anger. They don't necessarily share the experiences of the people who they seek to represent. In many cases, it is a tactical opportunity that is used to push an agenda that maybe somebody had held for a long time before, but now their moment can come forward. And in the end, the populist platform, in my mind, in a nutshell, is trying to provide simple answers to complex problems. And they might be right in their analysis of the sources of the anger, but the reason populism carries a pejorative sense is that it is a simple answer to a complex problem. Brexit is a good example of populism at work. The British people were deeply divided and had been increasingly divided in probably the 10 years leading up to the 2016 vote. And those divisions are very similar to the divisions we've seen in the United States, similar to the divisions we've seen emerge in countries like France, Spain, even Greece. But in our particular case, they manifested themselves particularly strongly around the European question. Europe became, for the populist politicians, the opportunity to pursue a longer-term agenda, which was Britain leaving the EU. As if that answer was the answer to all of the problems that reflected the division in the country. Of course, the reason the Brexit, I won't go into all the history, but the reason the Brexit campaign in the end was successful was that it was able to be the answer to everyone to their problem without anyone having to coordinate their answers. Yeah? So you have those people for whom immigration was seen as imposing an excessive burden on the provision of public services, healthcare, housing, schooling in deprived areas of the United Kingdom, and that immigration was associated with the government's loss of control over immigration from Central Eastern Europe. That started in 2004. Very much a British decision to open up its market to all of those people. But for many others, certainly in parts of the Labour Party, who are relatively open about immigration, this was an opportunity to constrain a European Union that was seen as a driver of market liberalization, of deregulation. And the Jeremy Corbyn agenda, and he's been skeptical about the EU for 30 years, the reason he did not campaign actively as the leader of the Labour Party to remain was that he himself, in a way, didn't feel it in his heart. He doubted it. So, and I can go through each of the elements here of the different teams who all coalesced around the Brexit debate. But it points partly to where we are today. We've gone from Brexit being a psychodrama, a sort of almost inexplicable mental aberration as it's seen by many people outside the UK, to actually becoming paralysis. This week, the UK is paralysed over Brexit. That's not a good place to be. I've been relatively relaxed, I would say, even about Brexit, in the sense that it is almost a process I think the country's had to go through. I think the parliamentary process has been doing what parliaments do, argue, debate, but in parliament, not in the street. There's no riots, there's no, there's a few protest marches, but this is a very British type of debate in that sense. And Britain has dealt with revolutionary moments in the past through quite pragmatic discussions, unlike France and other countries. But the problem we have right now is that the small window there was for Theresa May to get a deal through back on May the 13th was closed. And it was closed principally because Brexit is trying to put together impossible requirements, trying to keep Britain integrated into the European market, to keep it growing economically as successfully as it has done in relative terms in recent years, and to make sure that that growth continues to take place in the more deprived areas of the United Kingdom, including around its own manufacturing zones, which are the ones that have been benefiting the most from access to the European market, but which have also taken in the bulk of the immigrants, and which are themselves therefore conflicted.
But one of the interesting things, Robin, is that from my platform, from where I see things, the Brits really never embraced Europe. They were very interested in the economic benefits of having access to this large market. But if you go to any place in the UK, you won't see lots of European flags. You won't see European symbols on the number plates of cars. It was a difficult decision at the time, but in general there was never this thing that you see everywhere else in the European Union, where people gave up to some extent their national identity for a European identity. This didn't happen in the UK. So it's probably not unusual that today you see a country hugely divided between those who want to stay and those who want to leave. Because the leavers, to a great extent, want to leave the politics of Europe. They want to leave the court system, they want to leave some of the standards that have been imposed on the UK by Europeans, European bureaucrats in Brussels. So what is going to happen? How are we going to see the end of this process?
You see, but the problem here is, I mean, you're absolutely right in your analysis. Britain has always been a reluctant member of the European Union, island nation. We talk about continental Europe and Britain. Yeah, we were victors of sorts at the end of the Second World War. We were not invaded. We were bombed, but we survived. We've always been an offshore balancer to over-centralization of power in Europe. In a way, the EU is an over-centralization of power in Europe that Britain has never felt comfortable being part of. But these debates and this reason to want to leave applies to a minuscule proportion of the people in Britain. I call them the high priests of Brexit. And these are people who've wanted to get Britain out of the EU for the past 20 years. And their reasons are about national identity and sovereignty. Britain is having a different direction to the centralization, as it's seen, process of European integration. But Britain has struck a pretty good deal on this front. Britain is not in the Eurozone. Therefore not subject to all of the pressures of the European Central Bank. Britain is not in the Schengen Agreement, still controls its borders. Britain is not in all of the areas of human, of justice and home affairs, of some of the police cooperation that's there. Britain has been one of the biggest resistors on defense integration of Europe. Britain was having its cake and eating it, which is what it's accused of trying to do with the Brexit deal. But if you ever ask the question, do you want to stay? You would bring out exactly, Andrés, that deep instinct that this is not a natural state for Britain, which is why George Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, David Cameron's good ally, advised him strongly, don't do it. This will be unpredictable. But David Cameron, having won the Scottish referendum and the other referendum, I think, he was managing the Conservative Party, but he thought he could get away with it even closely. Now, what this means, therefore, to your question of where do we go, the reason we don't have Brexit right now, today, is 30 members of Parliament only. I know it sounds like It was 150 votes, it was 200 votes against. The third vote was lost by 58 seats. Now 58 seats means in essence 30 people voted against. Yeah, you swing the other 30, you'd end up with a 58 vote in favor. If they abstained, you'd end up with 1 or 2 votes in favor. So it was 30 people. 10 of them were the Irish Democratic Unionist Party. I'll say something about the backstop. And the other 20 were what I call these hardcore high priests of Brexit, for whom there is only one type of Brexit that will work, which is what I call the cathartic Brexit. There's no point leaving the EU if you don't literally cut your arm off in the process of doing it and have to put a new bionic arm on. You have to feel the pain. You have to kind of wake up from this slumber of being tied into an unnatural European Union and go and find global Britain over the waves. You can tell by the way I'm describing this that I'm not a supporter of that view. I think it's romantic, it's rather nice. We know romanticism and emotion are very powerful in politics. And they have a very clear emotional view. But they are terrified that the deal that Theresa May has struck to leave the EU is going to tie the future negotiations up in such a way that Britain will not be able to have a cathartic Brexit. Because the one thing you must remember, Theresa May's deal is simply the deal to leave. We're going to pay 40 billion euros, we'll give equal rights to EU citizens, and we have a 2 to 4 year period in which to negotiate the future arrangement. And in that time, we carry on being a non-voting member of the EU. But there is no future deal agreed. Nothing has been agreed. But the Irish backstop, this insurance policy to make sure that there will be no hard border between the North of Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, that insurance policy is seen by the Brexiteers, the high priests, as tying the hands of the next government or the current government into having to have a very close relationship with the European Union. Close regulatory alignment, close involvement in the customs union, and that's why they blocked it.
Does this also, to some extent, the backstop issue and the Irish issue, go to the heart of the eventual possibility that Northern Ireland and the Republic join forces in one way or another in a federation of some sort, and that the UK loses part of its Northern Irish belonging, if you like?
Again, emotional stuff is important here. The Catholic citizens of Northern Ireland are pretty close now to 50-50 with the Protestants. It's either 49.8% or 50.1, something like that. And yet support for unification of some sort of the island of Ireland, which at any point the people of Ireland can choose as part of the Good Friday Agreement that was struck back some 14 years ago, it does not completely tally to religious feeling. I think there are many Catholics in Northern Ireland who are quite happy to be members of the United Kingdom, citizens of the United Kingdom, but want to be able to have that easy relationship with the rest of the Union. So the most likely outcome of a drive towards unification, or even a demand for an independence and unification referendum, I think would come if there is a no-deal outcome. Exactly. And all of the polling shows if a no-deal outcome comes, then a number of the large proportion of the Catholic of the population may go the other way. Even some of the Protestants might as well, for business reasons. So again, this is another reason why Theresa May is so determined not to allow a no-deal to happen, because as former Prime Minister John Major and Tony Blair have warned, you will unleash things you do not understand. And again, it was another of these blasé comments made by Boris Johnson and others. Oh, the whole Irish thing, it's all blown up into a big, So, a populist comment.
Leslie.
Yeah, can I add to this whole question? I mean, part of the brilliance of what Robin's described here is to illuminate that, there are certainly underlying conditions and trends that created the possibility for populist politicians to put themselves in the driver's seat and change the direction of politics in the UK surrounding Brexit, and certainly in the US.
And in Mexico.
And in Mexico, but very far from inevitable that this needed to happen or was going to happen. And if you look at, in the U.S. case and in the UK case on those, in the US case on the presidential elections 2016, in the UK on the Brexit referendum, the numbers are so close. But what the populist politician does, and I agree with Robin in this, that it's certain leaders, is that they're willing to play hardball in a way that actually a lot of the professional politicians aren't. They're really willing to go, below the table and to mobilize outside of norms that have been long established, certainly in the UK and US context, and to use tactics that have been seen to be outside the bounds of legitimate political behavior. And what I observed, certainly in the case of Brexit, as an American who's lived in the UK for a very long time, since 2006, the thing that struck me the most during the referendum and in the 12 months after the referendum was the extent to which the dignified, civilized, educated, well-mannered British establishment did not get out and campaign, right? So people did not leave. And I remember sitting actually at Chatham House in the days before the referendum, and there were people who expressed concern. But if you look at a comparison, I think it's actually a really good comparison. Not long ago, we had Stacey Abrams, who ran for governor in Georgia, unsuccessfully, but she ran a really extraordinary campaign. If you look at the difference between what she was willing to do to try and win, in terms of going out to every single county in that state, going out to every single constituency, making that case, and you sort of compare it to what happened surrounding the Brexit referendum. The populist politicians did that. They used the media, they made the arguments, they were out with their people, and those who didn't want to leave, which were a very significant percentage of the population and a very significant percentage of the establishment governing politicians, they didn't put themselves out there. They spoke at Chatham House, which is, wonderful, and we appreciated that, but it was not speaking to the popular vote, and it was a popular vote. So one of the key issues, of course, is we tend to read backwards, that there's an inevitability because there's growing inequality, because there's wage stagnation, because there's increased division, because there's polarization, because there's partisanship, because there's a divided media environment. But in fact, a number of things that happen because of a series of political tactics and strategies, and it rained like you've never seen before on the day of the Brexit referendum, if you remember. And I was at the university, at SOAS, and nobody turned up to the university, right? The students didn't turn up on that day.
It rained in the southeast, which is important.
It rained in the southeast, so the turnout was down, right? And so these things all have a very significant impact. And I guess the last comment on that is, the same can be said about the period since the referendum, that we all know it didn't need to be framed, the question of how to deal with Britain's future relationship with Europe, what it needed to be, what it would be. The options became framed in a certain kind of way because of the political dynamics that Robin's talking about, not because it needed to be this way. And of course, it's possible because of the things that Andrés points to, that the case for Europe had never been made, the identity had never been created or consolidated across and throughout society. And so it becomes possible to create a very hard Brexit narrative, which gets a lot of traction, and it makes it difficult to have the kind of negotiation that is critical now. But it takes a lot of political mobilization and very certain tactics, and the populist politicians are far more willing to leverage those than the ordinary politicians that we're so used to having, certainly in the US and UK context.
Now we're going through a little Brexit here. I don't know if it's little, but we're going through a process in Mexico with a new government that was elected with massive support, historically massive support, which is a government that at the end wants to change the existing order in Mexico, that wants to challenge the institutions that we have built up over the last 30 or 40 years, that wants to bring Mexico back into a rather isolated position within the international order that is anti-globalization, that is what it calls neoliberal, conservative, whatever, that plays a great deal with the media as a strategy to be able to get its message across. President López Obrador does daily press conferences every day of the week, Monday to Friday, for about an hour and a half. This coming after a government that didn't have a single open press conference in 6 years. President Peña Nieto met with journalists, but he never had an open press conference where people could ask questions freely. We here see a lot of the parallels between this government and this president and Mr. Trump. In the way they use the media, in the way their core support group, which is only about 25 to 30% of the population, will support them no matter what, without any questioning, if you like, on whether they tell the truth or don't tell the truth. Mr. Trump, I think, passed the 10,000 falsehood mark sometime last week. President López Obrador has probably already a few hundred under his belt in the 5 months he's been president. So there are lots of parallels. Now, both of these people have been called populists. Mr. López Obrador will tell you that his definition of populism is helping the people who have not been helped by globalization, by neoliberal policies, by previous governments. Mr. Trump will tell you that his populism is getting more jobs to the United States, employing more people, resuscitating the Rust Belt and part of the Farm Belt and those parts of the U.S. economy that have been, if you like, a little bit on the margins of prosperity. But in both cases, this speech really is rhetoric rather than reality. I mean, Mr. Trump has fundamentally done for his elite, wealthy group of people more than he certainly has done for the rest of the country. And so far, Mr. López Obrador, who comes from the PRI, who comes from the established political part of Mexico, has also run into problems, even though he controls Congress, which Trump doesn't, in getting all of his agenda through. So I'm interested in your take on this as an American, but also sitting in Chatham House from the perspective of the UK, because part of one of the reasons, if you like, that was put to the British people to get them to support leaving the European Union was that it would allow them to have a closer relationship to other countries, including the United States. You remember that debate with Mr. Trump in the campaign as to whether they would be at the head of the line or at the back of the line in negotiating a new trade agreement.
Well, I mean, there's a few very interesting things here. I think there are some real parallels, as you suggest, in the core base, which I think for Trump is right around 30% right now.
Micrófono.
I mean, one of the things that Trump, it sort of builds on what you said, that he's so masterfully done, is in making that argument about in speaking to the base and proposing to deliver a number of benefits. It's on. And by the way, I never said thank you. This is so wonderful. Thank you so much. And I should say, I don't claim to be an expert on Latin America. We are hiring an expert, so please, with great humility. But it really is Andrés and Julian together who we should be doing it. We've known we've wanted to do it, but without Andrés, it would not be happening. So we are tremendously grateful to you, and we really do mean that. You sort of put your energy behind us, and you've kind of pushed us in the direction that we've wanted to go. But we wouldn't have done it without you. So thank you very much. It means a lot. I think that the other part of that, right? It's a nuance, but it's saying we will give you that you deserve certain things. You've been left behind, but it's framing it both in the case of Trump. And I think there's a parallel here, and I'm going to get to the values question in the UK. It's framing it not only as you need more, but it's you need more, and they've taken it away from you, right? It's always against somebody else. And that becomes critical in understanding why it is that it's so possible to hit how many falsehoods? 10
Trump, 10,000.
Thousands, right? It's probably many, many more. That's poor tracking. But it's easy to hit 10,000 falsehoods if what you're saying is that fact is just their way of trying to take something away from you, which is me, Donald Trump. Because it's all about that basic claim, which is why things like the Mueller report aren't changing the way that the base thinks about Donald Trump, because it's framed as the Democrats are trying to undermine the politician that you elected. So it doesn't become about the facts. It becomes about a certain kind of division. That framing is also playing out internationally, right? Trump's sort of, his rhetoric has all been about you're doing poorly because they have taken away from you, whether it's Germany on cars, whether it's China on any number of things. It's always about the othering. So the facts become much less relevant. And I guess the other, we've talked much about the economics, and this is where there is a parallel with the UK. There are many parallels, but on the social values, the other thing that, Trump hasn't delivered when we talk about, economic strategy, or the tax cuts have done very little for his base, but he has delivered on the values dimension, because he's delivering on the Supreme Court. And that matters a lot. That matters a lot, not only to his base, that matters a lot to the Republican voters. And that defines a lot of the division in the United States, where you stand on any number of core values, and that gets to the identity question. He's delivering that in the Supreme Court. He holds the promise of potentially delivering that a great deal more. And he's delivering that across the court system in the United States. And I think on the sort of question of the UK and Brexit and Europe, there is an identity question that underlies all of that, about what does it mean to be British. This goes back.
Exactly.
And that's played, again, very masterfully in a way that it becomes much less significant whether you deliver economically, and it becomes much less significant what the facts are. If at some level this is something about who we are, it makes it very, very difficult to fight with that.
By the way, I should just quickly mention something that Mariana did not mention, and that is, although this is Chatham House, we're not under Chatham House rules.
Oh, it's good to know.
It's on the record. So I just want to make sure that everybody knows that. Robin.
I just want to come in on the back of some of these very important points that Leslie was making. I mean, we have to be honest with ourselves. The people, or a large proportion of the people in Britain, America, many parts of Europe and America, have a right to be angry. Yeah, they have not had a good time. We all know the numbers. Yeah, 20 years of stagnation in real medium wages in the United States, and through large parts of the United Kingdom, thoroughly impoverished areas. We have been guilty of looking at aggregate numbers of GDP. GDP grows by 3%. Well, the world's doing well. Some areas might be growing by 4 or 5. Some might be growing at 0 or even be negative. There's the famous line that came out in the Brexit debate, which apologies for those of you who heard it before, but there was a debate where one of the people in favor of remaining in the EU spoke out to the audience. He says, look, we're in the EU. We've got the lowest rate of unemployment. We've got the highest rates of foreign direct investment. We've got the highest rate of GDP growth. Why would you leave the EU? And somebody shouted at the back, that's your GDP, mate, not mine. And that, there are real winners and losers, and the brilliance of the Leave campaign was to zero in on that sense of injustice and anger, and the winners and losers element of globalization. And we could throw in here, they did do it with some US-provided money and technology, not Russian, by the way. But even then, can you criticize a campaign for mobilizing 3 million voters who had no reason to vote for the past 5 to 10 years because they felt they were not represented. So even that's a difficult thing, I think, to criticize them on. Now, then the question becomes, what are you doing with it? Is there a policy? If populism becomes economic nationalism, that's okay. I mean, you know, Bruno Le Maire, the French finance economy minister, Peter Altmaier, the German economy minister, are flirting right now with economic nationalism. We need European champions. We've got to fight China. We've got to fight America. We need more of an industrial policy. Trump is doing economic nationalism. The Chinese are screwing us. We need a better deal. We need more jobs back here. I don't care about Apple if they keep all the global supply chains don't help my voters. They don't help people in Ohio or whatever. It's a fair point. So economic nationalism is being actually co-opted partly by some of the mainstream parties. And economic nationalism doesn't have to be populism. The worry for me is when populism becomes simply a route for division, the other. Populism normally it's me against you. It's us against the establishment. And it's not just us against you in a democratic sense. They are dangerous. They are enemies. The other becomes, turned into the enemy.
Music to the ears of the Mexicans here.
Well, I'll say my last point on this. I'll finish here. And this is what we're having to watch in Europe, is where's the line between, let's call it economic nationalism, and the drift from populism to authoritarianism? Because that is the move we have to watch out for. Authoritarianism is when you start to say, well, we need therefore to change the institutions because, as the Polish government has said, the courts are against us, so we now need the executive to control the courts. Or Viktor Orban says the press is not really representing the people, we need to own the press. Now, when you go to that level, that's not populism anymore, it's populism morphing into authoritarianism. So the question becomes is how strong are institutions? I'm not worried about the institutions of Britain. Yeah. I'm not worried about the institutions of America.
But I'm worried about the institutions in Mexico.
You might be worried about America, but...
Because our institutions are, first of all, recent. Our democratic institutions are recent. They are still vulnerable, especially when the executive has control of at least one of the other branches of government, and is looking to try to control the other branch, the judicial. So I agree with you. I mean, in the US, nobody worries, first of all, because Trump doesn't have today a majority in the lower house of Congress, and even though he has named people to the Supreme Court, it is still, to a great extent, an institution, highly respected, autonomous institution in the US. Here in Mexico, it's a bit of a different story. And we are in that penumbra of what you've just described as the transition from populism to authoritarianism or dictatorship, where the executive says, this is what I want to do, and I'm going to do it. I don't care whether you like it or not. I don't care whether it goes against the law. I mean, we have a case now, just to mention one of many, where the president has ordered in writing his ministers, his cabinet, to ignore a constitutional amendment that was passed in the previous administration, without going to make it a constitutional change. So from a legal point of view, that is authoritarianism. That is no longer populism.
I mean, I guess I would say that I think it's I think it's more complicated in the U.S. context. I think people are very much worried about the institutions. They're very much worried about whether or not the Supreme Court becomes something that's very partisan and doesn't feel independent. They're very much worried about whether the changes in the Republican Party put us in a position where it's very difficult to think about bipartisanship, and where will Congress succeed in ensuring its mandate, which is oversight of the executive. They're very worried about micro-level things, like whether or not elections work on a very local level. Voter suppression is happening across a number of dimensions. And so I think the debate about institutions and across the courts, right, are the courts being sacked, and will they become less independent? I think there's a very serious concern in the US about the quality of institutions, in large part because the quality of institutions is linked fundamentally, and I think we've always known this, but we know it more now than we ever knew before, to the norms, right? The expectations of the appropriate behavior that's pursued to shore up those institutions. And that sense of elites, but also, more broadly, people shoring up that appropriate behavior around those institutions is being eroded. And there's a very, I'm sure many of you have seen it, the book on When Democracies Die, Levitsky, and they talk about forbearance and toleration as being two really important norms that shore up institutions, right? That you know when, to respect the opposition, you know when to hold back. There's a sense of restraint that's embedded in the political culture, and those things are being eroded. So I think there is a very, it's sort of too stark to say, is America going to turn into, a fascist or authoritarian country? That's not the concern. The concern is that the quality of democracy is fundamentally eroded in incremental ways, and that become very hard to reverse in the short to medium term.
Good. Robin, I want to hit the third item on our on the title of our event today, and that is the threats to the international order. We've talked a little bit about the threats to national orders, both in the UK, the US, partly in Mexico. What are the threats as you see them today in priority? Shall we say, what's the most important threat you see, and perhaps one or two others? And how do you see these threats working themselves out? Do you think that the international order is something that is robust enough to withstand the assaults that Mr. Trump or Xi Jinping or Mr. Macron or Angela Merkel are looking to, as you call it, to go back to some economic nationalism, to withdraw a little bit from the post-World War II, Bretton Woods, WTO mechanisms, United Nations, and how do you see that developing over the short term?
So I think, from my perspective, at the top of my list right now is, I'll be, I suppose, quite stark about it, is this transition of the United States from being the most powerful nation in the world that believed it was benefiting from the world order that it helped create, to the most powerful nation in the world believing it is not benefiting from the order that it created. And therefore saying, you know what, I'm going to use a little bit of this muscle in some ways that maybe we haven't used it before because, hey, we've earned it. We've been defending this world order for a long time. Now people have been free riding on it. Those Europeans not spending enough on defense and just running big trade deficits against us, or the Chinese have come in, we brought them into the WTO, and you know what, they're not playing by the rules we thought, and in fact they're not going in the direction we thought politically either. Time to play hardball. And we will pick and choose who we need to have as allies, and we'll ignore whether they also uphold some of the norms and rules we believe in, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and then, other times when we want to think that country's an enemy, we'll suddenly bring all those rules out of the drawer, Maduro, and say, oh, democracy must survive. And so you've got this weird situation where at one moment you've got the US administration, talking about liberal democracy will never be defeated, and the next minute they're trying to put the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization to help Sisi, entrench further power as an authoritarian dictator in Egypt. So that, in my lifetime, and I've lived, and I've been fortunate to live in the gilded era of that post-war period, no major international wars in my world, in my part of the world, and nothing that has escalated, beyond the obviously terrible horrors and civil wars that have continued to happen all over the world. But in that world order, international order sense, it's not happened. Once America slips the leash, it's not so much what America might do, it's that everyone gets worried and everyone starts looking after themselves. And when everyone else starts looking after themselves, we've got some pretty interesting models from the 19th and early 20th centuries of what happens. So then, the thing is, what do you do about it? as I said, part of this America, if it's economic nationalism, and it only goes that far, and Trump says, I'm going to rewrite the terms of trade with China, we'll try and rewrite the terms of trade with the European Union.
Mexico and Canada.
Mexico and Canada, exactly. COMEXI, if I'm going to get the WTO tightened up, which it needs, by the way, I want to bring more investment back to the US, less global supply chains. That's fine. That's a rebalancing, as I said earlier, I think we can live with. But if it drifts over to, and you can see this in the US administration, I've been interested to hear Leslie's view on this. Trump strikes me as somebody who would be willing just to rebalance, and then maybe sit back inside the order or let the next president go back to it if they want to. But there are many people in the United States for whom the rise of China, and this is my second thing on my list of worries, and it emerges from the first. The rise of China is seen as an existential threat that if the United States does not get on top of now, and in a hard way, in a way where you use that American power, then you're not going to be able to do it later. Better to do it now while China is not as strong as it will be in 10 years' time. And in fact, let's make sure it does not get as strong as it wants to be in 10 years' time. So then you have to rely very much on a country like China saying, oh, okay, maybe we'll slow down on getting so strong. Maybe we need to let America still be the writer of the rules. This is many, as they said, there are many centenaries taking place in China right now. This is the centenary of the, I think it's 4th of May, 1919, student rebellion that, in essence was the beginning of the collapse of that pre-communist period, which then led to the foundation of the Communist Party in 1921, and then it's taken power in another big anniversary in 1949. So China is all about right now re-establishing a national identity which is more about nationalism. I mean, the communist legitimacy is being melded together with nationalism. You put that nationalism alongside an American insecurity and economic nationalism, maybe drifting over to a security nationalism, that's worrying. Now, I'll stop here and just say, what can we do about it? There's many bits and pieces between China and America. I'll leave that to Leslie to say. I would say that European nations and the EU and those countries that have benefited from this world order are going to have to step up and not free ride anymore. The EU is doing it. It struck trade deals with Japan, close, I think, to trying to do one with Mexico, completing one with Singapore, Vietnam. The Japanese, without America, went ahead, Mexico included, TPP, the new Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is a time where, there's another reason why Brexit is so badly timed. You need the UK on the rules-based order side of this debate, not trying to play cheerleader to a Trumpian America. If that's what global Britain is, and trying to buy and sell more products to Turkey or to some other country and keep them happy, that's not the global Britain I have in mind. But I think, therefore, there is a role, and we'll be looking to countries in Latin America, Mexico being a logical one. Where's Brazil, where Argentina? Those countries of heft and with engagement, can they be part of that coalition, if you want to call it? Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, maybe Mexico, others. The European Union plus Britain in or out. There is a group out there. And we've got to take some ownership. A bit like your thing, we didn't fight enough in Brexit for the world we were benefiting from and didn't understand when it was going wrong. Let's not make that mistake on international order.
Yeah, and of course the problem in that is that Britain is not, unfortunately, well placed right now to think strategically. Absolutely. Or with any amount of bandwidth about how to engage. The narrative of global Britain so far doesn't really have much to it, other than the two words. So that, I think this is one of the tragedies of Brexit, is just the extent to which it's taken tremendous intellectual horsepower. I mean, away from thinking strategically about Britain's role in the world. There is phenomenal intellectual horsepower in the UK, and it's just been turned into a highly consequential but very narrow and very limited debate. I mean, I'm completely with Robin and in this view that the the sort of international economic architecture is inevitably going to have to be renegotiated because there is no domestic support, certainly in the US on either side of the aisle, for keeping things as they were. There's broad consensus that America's relationship with China needs to be rethought. I think that Americans are much more divided on this very unpleasant way of interacting with Europe that the current US president has. But on China, I think there's just, that's been a long time coming. He was knocking at an open door. Although interestingly, I think it was yesterday I saw on Twitter that Biden was trying to reframe the narrative on China. And it was fascinating to watch the responses to it by leading foreign policy thinkers in the US saying, what is he doing? Democrats are saying, what are you doing, Joe Biden? You can't walk back the China threat because that's there. But the other thing I want to say is that, the other thing that's changing a huge amount is, of course, on the US side, and it's important for the transatlantic partnership, is the extent to which commitment to liberal values is going to be part of international order and the transatlantic partnership. And certainly this US president doesn't think that they should be. There are plenty of American presidents who have talked the talk of democracy and human rights and failed to back it up. But there aren't very many presidents who have simply said, we don't want to be part of it. We don't believe in it. We don't care, have your, And that's kind of what this president has done, not only in terms of really important friends and allies, but in terms of really important values and commitments that have been there, the entire post-war period. They're just being shed. So one of the questions that comes out of this is, are we looking at a rules-based order? Is that all that we can, is that all that we can aim for? And that's a big ask. And are we basically giving up the idea that it's a liberal international order? And people have countries have very different views on that. People have very different views on that. But there is a sense that that is the critical shift. And part of that's to do with the fact that China and India and any number of emerging powers didn't ever really like that liberal international order anyway. That perhaps the 1990s, right, the post-Cold War period, were perhaps about overextension and overreach, and part of the backlash is about liberal countries, right, countries that fashion themselves as being liberal internationally, as well as the emerging powers don't want that democracy and human rights and that the sort of constraints on sovereignty. Remember that the high priests of Brexit don't like the European Court of Justice. They don't like that part of the values part that infringes on sovereignty. So I think that the 90s in some ways may prove to be an exception, but we're undoubtedly moving into at best a renegotiation of a rules-based order, I think.
Neither of you have mentioned Russia as a threat to the international order. Any thoughts?
For President Putin and those around him who share his worldview, this is perfect. Because the more the world becomes free for all, without structures, the more room there is for a country like Russia, which is ruthless, self-interested, and insecure, to leverage that insecurity. And it has so much more influence and power in a world in which there are no rules compared to the world in which there are rules. Which is why, the big shock to Vladimir Putin was to wake up to the realization that maybe the EU was more of a threat to his view of a centrally controlled Russia than actually NATO. NATO was a rather useful enemy, and he could use it to mobilize people. But the EU there was nothing he could get his hands on. It was a set of values and norms that penetrated into society. And he's done his best, to be frank, to undermine the EU more than NATO since then. And the irony is you've got the United States in its value-free context, allowing economic nationalism of Steve Bannon to also be a form of me-firstness that actually looks to Russia almost as an example, and buying the Russian propaganda that we're upholders of traditional family values, which involve obviously torturing and imprisoning people, but without trial, whatever those family values are. But Look, my point of view is, I don't mention Russia because it's kind of simple. President Putin, I think, believes that Russia inside a globalized world will be a Russia that gradually loses influence and loses sovereignty, because its economy would get meshed into the rest of the world, and with 120 million slowly declining, too much territory, and a system of government that is not capable of taking advantage of globalization the way Western systems are, Russia would gradually lose influence. So he's into spoiling and spoiler. If we start undermining our own system, what's not to like? But I don't see Russia as kind of systemic. And a lot of what Russia is doing right now is still today defensive. Everyone talks about Russia as, oh, they're playing it so brilliantly. They're out there, making it Russia's world. No, he's managed to hang on to Syria, just. They had the port of Tartus since 1958. They've had the air base in Latakia since the 1960s. They nearly lost it. They've had Crimea as their main naval base forever. They nearly lost it. You go through each of these examples. It's still, in my mind, a defensive player. It's a spoiler. You just need to be awake to it and aware of it. And I think more people are now than they were pre-Ukraine.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing to that. I mean, I pretty much agree with that, but it does depend on where you sit. And I think we are all cognizant of the very real security concerns that people on the eastern borders of Europe have. And those are genuine, and they're legitimate, and they're worse now because of the current administration's position with respect to NATO, the uncertainty of the transatlantic partnership working effectively through NATO. And so that's very real and very genuine. So I know that Robin, and we all sort of, at the systemic level, it's a different question. The other area, though, which, Russia's not doing itself any favors, and the Mueller report has certainly revealed this, that, it's certainly creating domestic problems for democracies, right? Actively working to sow division and undermine the integrity of elections, and that's real and that's serious. And I think that it's not systemic in a sort of geopolitics way as one of the major threats, but it is a very significant thing. And public opinion, is the public is aware of this and very unsettled by it, I think. I completely
agree. I was maybe being overemphasizing too much a point, and I think you're right to pull it back, Leslie, to the real threats to political systems in Central Eastern Europe and in Western Europe as well. Mm-hmm. You look at the connections into the Marine Le Pen party, to the Lega Nord in Italy, and where Russia could pull some of those instincts from populism towards authoritarianism. So I suppose my frustration is that the big debate right now, to my mind, is how we deal with China. Mm. Because, look at Africa. The Belt and Road Initiative, we're all worried about what has tended to come with this, just give the money, and you'd rather give it to a government that's stable. You don't particularly worry if it's Nazib Razak in Malaysia, who of course has turned out to have been involved in huge corruption scandals, but at least he struck the deals on the rail deals with China. So China, as it goes global, a bit like we did back in the early 20th century, 19th, and probably even into the second half of the 20th century, has been backing up autocratic leaders and even been allowing a certain amount of corruption to go on. But you look at how quickly China is trying to pivot right now on the Belt and Road Initiative to get it back into a place where it'll be at least somewhat acceptable to Western Europe at least, and maybe to some of the host countries.
And here in Latin America. We have 12 of the Latin American countries who've signed on to Belt and Road. Mexico hasn't, but
what China might do, at least you can have a debate with China about, okay, maybe we need some environmental regulation, maybe there needs to be some transparency on the bidding process. There's a debate to be had because China is secure. China believes it can win in a globalized world. Russia is the opposite, and there is no debate to have with Russia. So when Russia starts to want to interfere in Libya, when you see some of their private security forces in parts of Central Africa, you've got to get worried, because there they really will support autocratic regimes and corruption, because that's the model.
One of the very interesting more recent developments brings me to the issue of Venezuela. You saw that the failed, if you like, movement that Guaido tried the day before yesterday, in one way or another was played by the US administration as a Russian interference in the eventual plans for Mr. Maduro to leave Venezuela and so on. And of course the Russians, first of all, the Venezuelans owe them a lot of money. They've been lending a lot of things to Venezuela. But more importantly, for the Russians, I think it's a very exciting moment to be able to poke the eye of the US, to go back on the Monroe Doctrine and say, you know, that's no longer the case. We are here and we participate. With the case of China, it's even more so, because China has invested also enormous amounts of money in infrastructure projects in Latin America. And the fact that these two, shall we say, vestiges of, on the one hand, the Cold War in the case of the Russians, and the rising importance of China within this region of the world is also something to reckon with, and something that is very different from the way we were behaving before. And then you have the US responding by saying we're going to put an embargo, a blockade, not an embargo, a blockade on Cuba, in order to make sure that the Cubans stop receiving oil from the Venezuelans and sending the material and the support that they're sending. So, any thoughts on Venezuela, Leslie, as you follow it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my one reaction, certainly to the last few days, has been that with respect to U.S. engagement, that it hasn't been wise, and I think the entire the decision to recognize is one of the most important diplomatic tools that exists, and should be taken very carefully. And even if it might be the right thing to do, it doesn't make it the right thing to do, as it were, or the effective thing to do. And I think that the U.S.
Mr. López Obrador would be very happy to hear you say that.
Well, but I mean, I'm very pragmatic. One wants the right outcome, but the question is not putting that first. It's putting that at the end of a strategy. And I think the U.S. has taken a very quick line and then sort of pushed itself into a corner in terms of its ability to actually facilitate some sort of pragmatic negotiation that could lead in a constructive direction, which is not an easy thing to do in any case. But I think the sort of the tweets, right, shoring up the not a coup that didn't look like it was going to have a lot of traction in any case have not been intelligent.
It's a very difficult, as you say, a very difficult situation, because one wants to get rid of Mr. Maduro in general, because we understand what the damage he's done to Cuba and Chavismo and so on, to Venezuela, sorry. But on the other hand, he does have a core group of support. He is a populist. He is an autocrat. He has managed to polarize the Venezuelan population enormously. Interestingly enough, the people who supported Chavez originally, the marginalized, the poor, the ones that did not benefit from any of the oil riches that Venezuela has and so on, no longer support Maduro. So he has lost that core group of support, and I think he knows it. And he's worried about it, and there's a clear question as to whether he can hang on for much longer. I don't think he can. I think this was sort of the beginning of the end of the regime. It'll take perhaps a little bit more for the pushing to function. The U.S. has been all over the place on this, talking about all options being on the table, military options. The Assistant Secretary of Defense changed travel plans yesterday. Instead of going to Europe, he stayed back in Washington because he wants to make sure that the pre-positioning of strategy and all of that. And then you have Mr. Bolton, and you have Elliot Abrams, all of these people sitting there, talking, and Trump threatening, which he loves to do. He threatens us all the time. I don't think there's any country that has been more threatened by Mr. Trump than Mexico. We've been threatened with a wall. We've been threatened with mass deportations. We've been threatened with economic sanctions, with tariffs, with whatever you want. And he does it constantly. Yesterday was another day in which he decided he was going to bash Mexico. So we are very accustomed to it. And we're also very accustomed to the fact that many of these threats are empty. They do not really represent a strategy. They do not represent a policy. They just represent his occurrence at the moment of what he thinks would be a good way to move something from one direction to another.
Well, and he's always talking to his people at home, right? It's multivocal signaling, right? It is a very important part of his signaling to his base about the border, and as we know, because we've seen the money that he's asking, the next set of money for strong borders, immigration, it's going to get worse, right? The Mexico bashing. Because that is going to be the #1 issue in the 2020 elections, immigration, borders, that kind of security. So it's going to get very nativist and very, very nasty.
Why don't we take a few comments, questions from the audience? I see lots of interest right away. We have about 20 minutes. So let's see, I saw Enrique Hidalgo and then you. We need microphones. I have a microphone here that isn't being used. So if somebody will take it and give it to Enrique, and then we can move from there. So please identify yourself so that Leslie and Robin know who you are.
Enrique Hidalgo, I work for ExxonMobil. My question has to do with your discussion about this kind of rudderless international order that you've described. And I will be very curious about your thoughts on one country that was just mentioned in passing, India, and a country that was not mentioned, Germany, who seem to be in the middle of these big vectors that seem to be at play. So that's my question. Thank you.
Okay.
Nadine Karachi Estrada. I'm curious to know how much you feel that Facebook had to do with Brexit. There's been, I watched a TED Talk yesterday about it, and there's been New York Times articles about this, citing this. Zuckerberg's not willing to turn over data of targeting people who have shown in polls that they're leaning to be persuaded in any political judgment, and how they've been bombarded. We know this. And
do you mean Facebook specifically, or Facebook. Social media in general?
I just want to talk about Facebook, because that's what's been uncovered and talked about now, and through social organizations. Facebook and how it contributed to Brexit.
Okay, thank you. We'll take one more, and then we will over here, and then we'll give them a chance to respond, and then we'll have another round.
Thank you. My name is David Engel. I'm Australia's ambassador to Mexico and various other countries here. Thank you very much for the comments. They were fantastic, and I'm particularly struck by the comments on China and on the question of the maintenance of whether it's going to be a liberal international order, rules-based order or not. In that context, 2008 we had the global recession, and one of the great outcomes of that was, of course, the G20 and the role that the G20 played in trying to preserve the liberal international order. What role do you see for the G20 in addressing some of these questions, particularly those issues that seem to have become central to many of the debates, including in this country, such as inequality and how to address a more equitable outcome for people as a function of some of these great international drivers like globalization?
Thank you. Shall we?
You want to go first?
Sure. I'll jump in. I'll probably want to say something about all of them, though. So on Germany, Enrique, no one's in a good position right now. I can't think of a major country. Leslie was mentioning, Britain's completely AWOL, absent without leave on these big debates at the moment because the government cannot process. At least the American government seems to still have some capacity to do international affairs, even if the White House doesn't drive it. Some of its Africa policy and its Balkans policies have been quite constructive in the last couple of years. But Germany is, I think, undergoing a very difficult transition of its own. And is gradual. The Helmut Kohl through to Angela Merkel. If you listen to Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, EKK as she's known, the new lead person who's going to take over from, most probably from Angela Merkel as Chancellor, she's come out with quite a hard-edged line, trying to get voters back on the CDU side that they lost in the immigration push. There's a much more skeptical attitude in the United States. Angela Merkel herself has said we're going to have to, as Europeans, take more responsibility for our own future. We can't trust the United States quite as much as we did before. And yet within the European Union, they can't recreate, as Britain leaves the EU, they can't recreate the old Franco-German motor. The Franco-German motor is there now. It's not a motor, it's like a defensive lock. They want to hold on to each other so neither goes off with others into other directions, but they can't be an agenda setter. And there was a hope briefly when Macron came into power that would happen, but it's not. But I could spend a long time talking about Germany. But the point I want to make is the basis of their own self-identity is weakening. An America that was backing European integration, that they could treat as their principal ally. Now they question, no, we can't follow America on all of these things. And we're getting criticized. In fact, we're now painted as the bad boy in the Trumpian narrative of the trade relationship. And some of it is true, as always, some of it is justified. And at the same time, within the EU, an enlarged EU without the UK takes away the triangle that they managed quite carefully, pro-integration politically with France, pro-economic integration with the UK. So what I'd say about Germany is they're not in a position to lead. We just need to make sure they do not become a spoiler themselves within European integration. And I don't think they will, by the way, anytime soon. But there's a lot of rebuilding going on in Germany and a lot of atomization of the politics there, as you well know as well. I'm saying very little about India, except that having just come, the Facebook question is relevant on this, having just come in from San Francisco, where I spent a couple of days meeting with technology companies and so on, the big discussion there was all about India. Because actually India is the swing player on where technology might go and where technology might go with politics. And is Modi going to take it in a negative route, potentially in a more populist/nationalist route? Or does India have some of the checks and balances through its federal system, through its parliamentary system, to be able to hold it back? The reason India never comes up, from me at least, in these big conversations, it is not a country that has the capacity or interest right now to act strategically. I mean, around its border, yes, the relationship with China, which seems to be improving from what I see at the moment. Although obviously they have the fears about Sri Lanka, especially if it would go back into the more pro-Chinese orbit that might happen if there's this presidential election. But they're focused on their neighborhood, terrorism, and like China, this huge internal agenda of how they deal with their massive young population, who, with climate change, are getting less and less opportunity in the agricultural economy, and yet may not have the manufacturing transition to go through. So I think if I were an Indian leader, my God, I've got such an internal agenda, there's almost no time to play it, more broadly politically. I think on Facebook, very quickly, the movie that came out for an uncivil war that was put on TV the other day was absolutely explicit in its fingering, if you want to call it, the aggregate IQ role in this process. So Cambridge Analytica, aggregate IQ, all linked to Robert Mercer, the US billionaire and also political activist, very heavily on the right. There seems to be a fair amount of evidence, and there's a very good Guardian journalist who's done a lot of work on this, that they, in a way, used almost the Brexit debate as a test run for the Trump campaign, or at least for trying out the Tea Party mode. Not the Russians. There was all the numbers show a heavy amount of maybe a spike in Russian bot activity in the 2 or 3 days before. But what won, you could argue, what won the referendum was the 1 to 2, maybe 3 million people who voted who'd not voted before. It was the fact that it was a 72% turnout rather than a 68% turnout or a 65% turnout. The 65% turnout, Remain would have won. At a 72% turnout, the people who came out were people who'd not voted before. And according to the reports that have been put out there, they were given data. Now, whether this data was trawled off this Facebook release through Cambridge Analytica, I don't know, so I can't comment on it. I've heard reports to that effect, but I don't know it. But what they did do very cleverly was identify a whole segment of the population that was most able to be used through the Facebook mechanism of creating communities by dropping in stuff about football, clickbait. And then when you saw the clickbait came in, they then started feeding in immigration, and then UKIP, and blah, blah, blah. So it did play a role, but did these 3 million people not have a right to vote? I go back to this point again, what I said earlier. So yeah, we could have remained, and we would have remained because people would not have heard how frustrated so many people in Britain were. Facebook might be in trouble on this, but there's a deeper thing. Why don't I leave the G20 for a minute and let you take that on? I'll come at this time again.
Yeah, no, the G20 question, I mean, yeah, clearly a much better, important forum because the distribution of economic power has radically changed. But I think the interesting part of your question is, what can it do to help to give states the space to address domestic concerns that are partly a product, but not entirely of inequality. And that's the really tough question, isn't it? Because that's where it's sort of winding back the clock to how we used to think about cooperation in the 1950s and 60s, which was to give states and governments the room to take care of their people, right? The welfare state and all the rest of it. But I don't know. I'm still skeptical and nervous of, even with more players in the room, or possibly with more players in the room, that there's the global context has changed so much. The level of integration, is there the willingness and the ability to grant those exceptions? I'm cautiously pessimistic, I think.
Can I just tack on to that?
But it's necessary.
Tack on to the cautious pessimism. It strikes me the G20 did a great crisis management role in 2008-9. At best, it could be a crisis manager again at a strategic level. And right now, you have to ask, if there was another crisis today, certainly in Europe, let's say the Italian banking sector went crazy, would China step in this time with the standoff that it has? And China was critical in providing lending, and its stimulus package, as you know, was a huge player in getting out of the 2008 crisis. The one place where it's been useful has been in this very technocratic area of the Financial Stability Board and setting some of the guidelines for strengthening up the Basel process. So when it gives its authority to technocratic processes to work, I think it has played a useful role. But I don't think those technocratic processes will get to inequality. That, in the end, ends up being about national governments and probably some sort of trade-off on some of the big rules between big players. And the G20 is so diverse now in this free-for-all world, it's even less, I think, as Leslie was saying, capable of coming to some really strategic answers.
We'll take one more question, and then I'm going to ask Ricardo to come up and do a conclusion. Ricardo González Horta from Deloitte. Miguel, I think, and then Albert.
It has been a wonderful set of opinions and set of comparisons that I have heard today. My name is Miguel Jauregui. I'm an OBE, so I am worried about Britain. And I've been worried about Britain for a long time. Because I think as you well put it, I don't have to repeat anything. However, the vote that happened on that poll, I don't think it would be the same if there was a new one. So basically, a very narrow comment or a question, or however you want to interpret it. What do you think will happen? And I think you said it, but I would like to see it more clearly. What do you think will happen between Scotland, Northern Ireland, the world? And it's a big question, but I mean, how does that affect the world, Europe? And obviously, what we've been looking forward to, since we are going to go international with more free trade agreements, if you leave the European Union, then we will have to cook up something to be united. Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. Allard?
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much. It's been fascinating. I'm Allard Brown-Gort. I represent the University of California here in Mexico. A quick question, very, very broad. We've all heard that people who don't know history are destined to repeat it, blah, blah, blah. Much more, I like the comment, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it rhymes. Right now, I think, and some of your comments reflect that, there is some thinking about parallels with the 1930s, the rise of authoritarian government and fascism and so on. But there are also, I think, parallels to the period before 1914, to the end of the first period of broad globalization. Very quickly, which era does this rhyme better with?
Thank you. Leslie?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm very skeptical of the, I guess I would be on the side of, there are some things that are the same, but there's so many things that have changed. And I tend to be, I mean, people really do, and it's valuable, right? Like to run the 1930s analogy in particular. But yeah, I don't think any of them actually stress test all that well, which isn't said there aren't some interesting things there. And obviously this comment is more, this question is more for Robin, but I'll just say very quickly that I think I probably differ from Robin on this. I mean, you know, I hope well, I don't know if I hope I'm right or I'm wrong, but I don't see Brexit happening anytime soon. You know, I think this is going to go on for a very long time, and watch, I'll be wrong on October 31st, but I think we're going to be in a kind of altered space, and it's a question of whether that can come to a, you know, stable staying place, but I think it's not happening anytime soon.
Robin?
I suppose if I had to pick, I'd lean towards the 1930s. I mean, I know the US-China thing is there for the 1914 Thucydides kind of trap, but I think the Chinese are so determined not to be Germany. You see what I'm saying? They so read their history, and they're so aware of their history, and they're so trying not to fall into that trap, that I hope that they will avoid it. I think we're much more, for my take, in that 1930s period where the impact, the delayed impact of the Great Depression and what it's done to political structures and systems, combined with technology, which has just awakened people's engagement, but provided many more effective routes for what Leslie described, the underhand methods of the more extreme populist, hard-nosed people who are using this technology way more actively and aggressively than the people, I would call it, more on the right side of things. So I'd lean towards the 1930s. Now, at least we went through the 1930s again, so, you know, some lessons have been learned, and it'd be hard for fascism to come back up again, but some other type of populism might come through. On Miguel, you've been worried about Britain for a long time. We should discuss why you've been worried about Britain for a long time. Britain's been underperforming economically for a long time, and that's part of the Brexit conundrum, is that, you know, British productivity has stagnated for a good 10 years prior to the Brexit debate. You know, our primary and secondary education, lack of investment infrastructure, low levels of R&D investment, small amounts of long-term patient capital. I mean, you can add up the North-South divide, you know, and this is the irony of Brexit, is that, I'll come to you with how it might happen. If Brexit happens, British politicians will have nowhere to hide. They will have to take on those issues in a far more aggressive way than they have, in a way, they've not done it in previous years, because they will be in a much more precarious position economically. I hope that kind of discipline, if we are to leave, would be positive. And there is something about politicians having a sense of agency. As analysts, we can say what politicians should do. Politicians tend to do things when they kind of want to do them, or feel they have to do them, or are driven to do them. And if Britain leaves, my only silver lining on that is that British politicians will reacquire a sense of agency that for whatever reason they seem, many of them, to have lost as members of the EU. They just can't play the EU game like other EU politicians play it. Logically they should, they've got a good hand to play, but they don't play it. They spend all the time cutting back, resisting. So what will happen, what could happen?
Stay tuned.
We're going to give you
Stay
your
tuned
crystal
for the next Robin Leslie show, which we will have here sometime next year, early next year.
You mean I'll be held against what I say now?
Yes, absolutely.
So I could see this being a limbo for a long time, but I think the British political system will not accept, and MPs will not accept, an extended limbo. I also do not think they will accept a second referendum unless, and this is where I'll come to my point, the only way through right now is either a no deal, that Britain just leaves and takes its chances. And what it'll do then, it won't change anything. It'll then start negotiating for the next 4 years. If we leave with no deal, the first thing we'll have to do is to start negotiating a deal. And there'll be a 6-month gap, so the no deal won't be a no deal. The EU will say, right, okay, it's no deal. In that case, we better take 6 months to get ready for it, and let's see if we can agree at least some basic parameters. So there'll be disruption, but it won't be like falling off a cliff. If you come to withdrawal, you then get 2 to 4 years of having to negotiate the future relation. Whatever happens, I think Remain, personally in my mind, is the least likely outcome except through a referendum. And I suppose this is all down to the Labour Party now. The Conservative Party can't deliver it. Will Labour come through? And this is an incredibly difficult debate. They've not wanted to own it. They want the Conservatives to own it. My instincts tell me they won't come up with a solution. But if Theresa May were to say, accept my deal, and I will allow a referendum to take place.
But with the referendum, well, I'm sorry, we're leading into the other time, but
I know.
The referendum could be on two things. It could be on the deal, whatever that is, or it could be a retake of the 2016
What do you mean by
referendum.
retake? Well,
that is, do we stay in or do we leave?
Yeah, but we leave with no deal.
But the interesting thing is that I've talked to lots not, but to many Remain, people who voted Remain, who today would not vote Remain again, because they are very annoyed at the way Europe has treated the UK.
This would be my closing point. If there is a second referendum, I think the likelihood of voting leave is actually higher now than before.
I agree.
So that's why I think, I can't give you the route right now because it's just too complicated, I don't see it, but I think we'll be out this time next year. You think we might be in, so we'll have to come back and see what happened.
Sounds great. Ricardo, I want to, first of all, again, express my appreciation both to Robin and to Leslie for making the trip here, but also to Deloitte and specifically to Ricardo González Horta, Deloitte partner and the National Director for Fiscal and Legal Services, which is probably the most important part of what Deloitte does anyway, for some concluding remarks, and then we'll thank all of the panelists and Deloitte together.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Andrés.
No?
Can you hear me there?
You might want to hold
it. Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much for this presentation. I think it's been fascinating and insightful. For a lot of us, Brexit looks like something very far away from Mexico, but it does have consequences in the global economy. Mariana asked me a little bit to talk about the economic consequences of uncertainty, so that's one of the biggest questions and difficult to answer. I've been doing some research, and as good economists always do, the figures vary significantly when we try to analyze what would be the potential consequences of a Brexit. So I assume that the economist and my good friend Gerardo are having fun just doing a lot of economic reports. You cannot hear me? Okay, good. So there will be practical consequences coming out from Brexit for the businesses. There'll be consequences for those businesses that are located in the UK doing businesses in the European Union. There will be consequences, maybe less, for businesses that are located in the European Union that trade with the United Kingdom. And there will be important consequences for the value chain in the whole continent. And even for countries such as Mexico that today have a free trade agreement or an agreement with the European Union, we will have to renegotiate something with the UK, because otherwise automatically the WTO rules will be enforced. So even though Brexit looks far away, yet for Mexican companies doing business or Latin American companies doing business in the European Union, they will have consequences. There are some economists that already say that there are consequences from the time in which Brexit was announced, when the referendum results were announced. And there are several analyses that already say that part of the effects of inflation, part of the effects on the growth of GDP are already affecting the UK economy. And what we've seen in practice as Deloitte is that we see a lot of our clients asking what they should do in the future. And it's a very difficult question to answer. But we've seen companies beginning to take decisions of slowing down their investment in the UK. As you know, the UK is seen as a gateway to the European Union, as a very good place to establish corporate headquarters and from there move to the European Union. But we are seeing some of the companies asking themselves whether it's right to be in the UK or to have a UK headquarters to do business in the European Union. We've seen some companies deciding to invest, UK companies deciding to invest outside of the UK just because their value chain will be affected. So they are beginning to decide to put some of their manufacturing operations out of the UK into the European Union to avoid effects on tariff and non-tariff barriers. The consequence in the future will definitely vary. If there's a soft or hard Brexit, the consequences are very different. If there's a hard Brexit, that means that the WTO rules will immediately be in effect on the trade and relationship between the UK and the European Union. And when we say that WTO rules will be applied, that means that a lot of the goods going from the UK into the European Union will be subject to an increased tariff, and that will affect their businesses. But not only that, if they come up with a negotiation that could be close to a free trade agreement, then you'll have a lot of barriers, non-tariff barriers of goods that will affect the UK goods going to the European Union and vice versa. So in any case, either a hard Brexit, where the WTO rules will apply, or a soft Brexit, where they might come out with something like a free trade agreement, there will be effects. As I was telling you, the analysis made by the economists vary significantly, but if we take a good scenario from some of these studies, apparently in a hard Brexit scenario, the effect in GDP could go between 2 and 3%, and in a soft Brexit, it could be between 1 and 2%. So regardless of the scenario, either a moderate soft Brexit or a hard Brexit, there will be significant consequences for the UK economy. Finally, some of the lessons from Mexico, I would say, is first, as Andres was saying, somehow we're living our small Brexit with NAFTA. Obviously, the expectation is that we will not leave NAFTA and that the new NAFTA will come in force, that TMEC. But the reality is that Mexico has also suffered significant consequences out of this negotiation. Since President Trump announced that the NAFTA was going to be renegotiated, we do have a lot of our clients, multinational clients, that have decided to slow down their investments in Mexico. So there are consequences, very similar consequences in our context of the renegotiation of NAFTA. And another important comment is uncertainty does have consequences. And as Andres was discussing, uncertainty in Mexico creates economic consequences. We have a government that doesn't send clear signals to the investors. So one day we hear the government saying we will respect the law, but the next day we see a memo coming out saying, well, but this education law, you can forget about it, right? Regardless of what the Congress says. Then we hear a government saying we'll attack corruption, which I believe we all agree, which is great. But the next day we see that 70% of government contracts are signed directly. Then we say we will respect private investors, but we will cancel the airport. Or we will respect the institutional order, but we will assign specific persons that don't have all the necessary capability within the institutions to take care of them. So a lesson for us, regardless of the global arena, is that we have to eliminate uncertainty in Mexico. If we keep with this level of uncertainty, the same consequences as those that we discussed on Brexit will happen to Mexico. Investment will slow down, businesses will be very careful, and a lot of businesses will just stop investing in Mexico. So I think that's a good lesson for us to learn. So with that, I would like to appreciate your participation. I would like to thank our speakers, Andrés, Robin, Leslie, and Mariana for being our partner. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for your comments.
Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Ricardo. We value our partnership with Deloitte a great deal, and fortunately we were able to do this morning. And I will ask Robin, as director of Chatham House, to commit to come back to Mexico City next year, 2020, when we can talk about all of the things we talked about today with greater certainties or greater uncertainties. We don't know.
New uncertainty.
But in any case, thank you both for being here, and thank you, Mariana, for organizing this.